They'd just be paperweights. So this idea that China is this technological marvel, it's going to take us over, I mean, it just ignores basic math, which I also find amusing that it's an American argument. We know the Russians are capable of using precision-guided munitions. It's not their primary, but they have them. I have seen nothing in the war suggests that if they're either using them, or if they are using them, they know how to use them. I've seen very few precision strikes at all. I've seen satellite photos of airports where there are 60 holes and only one of them is in the runway. Which tells me that the bombing of I'm assuming you're referring to the theater bombing and the hospital bombings in Mariupol over the last couple of days.
Yeah.
That just suggests that this is just part of a general civilian infrastructure destruction campaign, which is exactly what they did in Grozny, which is exactly what they did in Aleppo, and now they're doing it in Kharkiv and Mariupol and Mykolaiv and Kiev. And the goal is to destroy civilian infrastructure so utterly, so completely, that the population starves, that they feel that they have to go, and that anyone who stays to fight has nowhere to hide. That's how the Russians have been doing war for 20 years now. So if they have precision capability, they're saving that for another day because it's just not relevant to this conflict at this point. From the Russian point of view, they cannot be secure unless they control all 9 of those gaps that I discussed earlier.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And when you look at what Russian threatened NATO with just before he launched the war, he listed all the countries that he wanted to be able to write their security policies and make sure that no NATO forces were ever in them ever. Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden. So you would have to give the Russians de facto control over the lives and security policy of a total population that is double that of all of Russians combined. So from a certain point of view, yeah, he's right, but that's still utter, unmitigated horseshit. We will never abide by that, and neither would any of the countries in between.
So essentially, he'd have to swallow all of Eastern Europe in order to get
I won't bother you if you give me everything I want and let me do whatever I want with these 300 million people. Putin has been playing a weak hand fairly well for the last 25 years. He's made threats and been able to get people to give him security advantages on the cheap. He certainly did that with Georgia. It's like he invaded Georgia while Putin and George W. Bush were sharing a box at the Olympics. So his timing has been good. His approach has been good, and he's gotten a lot for very little. But he reached a point where it was no longer a low-cost expansion. And now he's discovering that it's a little bit more involved. I don't think that's going to stop him. But it does mean that strategy needs a new evolution.
How long do we think this conflict goes? I know that's impossible to predict, but any guesses?
If you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said he would have captured Kiev in less than a month and the whole country in less than 3. Now I'm thinking that the whole country will certainly fall in less than 6. But one of the downsides, that's not the right word, one of the characteristics of this civilian obliteration program that the Russians are launching is it's not quick. It'll take several weeks to reduce cities the size of Kiev and Kharkiv to rubble. That's a lot of ordnance, and the number of troops that he has in place in Ukraine is wildly insufficient to that task. So you should expect, in fact, I think we are seeing troop movements within Russia proper, moving many, many, many more forces to the border, and we'll probably have a million Russian soldiers in Ukraine before scale.
Yeah.
And Sarajevo, it was Bosnia's mountainous. There were a lot of places for the rebels to hide. It's not a perfect comparison when you're talking about Ukraine. Ukraine's got the farm fields. And so as long as there's vegetation, and as long as there are buildings, the Ukrainians are going to be able to hide and snipe and participate in guerrilla war, which is part of why the Russians are going to destroy everything.
Brutal.
We haven't seen anything like this in the world since World War II. And even then, the closest comparison would be when the Nazis were going through Ukraine, and there were Ukrainian nationalists who sided with the invaders because they had just been through a several-year political repression, genocide, and Stalin-caused famine. And from their point of view, anyone was better than Stalin. And then when the Russians came back, everything that the Nazis had not destroyed, the Russians then destroyed. That's the level of what we're looking at here. We haven't seen this since 1940. There aren't a
Bad
lot.
signal. What's that?
I mean, it's
There
not a
aren't a
great
lot?
signal, sure, but there
Yeah.
just aren't a lot. Russia keeps most of its, the Russian economy was so moribund that they kept most of their physical assets abroad because it was all about oil and natural gas sales, getting dollars and euros, and then, investing them however you can. When it comes to American assets in Russia, I mean, I've said this to investors for years. You should be prepared for your Russian investments to go to zero because that's where this is going to go. That's not how it goes with every single Russian regime throughout recorded history. This one is no different. So when, February 22, when the war started, things got locked down really quick. The day that the central bank was sanctioned, it's like, that's it. Everything goes to zero. Here we are. When you're talking American assets in Russia, you're talking like the embassy. I mean,
some oil
sure.
platforms, I guess, and stuff like that, probably.
Oh, I see what you're talking about. Oh, okay. I was thinking American government. I'm sorry. I'm making fun of the wrong thing.
Got it. Yeah. Switch targets.
Yeah. So Shell and Exxon and BP are the three biggest investors in Russia. Shell and Exxon run the Sakhalin projects out in the Russian Far East. It's all offshore. It's all moving sea ice. The Russians are absolutely useless partners in there. So when Shell and Exxon decided to back out, they're just shutting the projects down, and that's it. By the way, a lot of that energy went to China, so China might actually end up getting less energy moving forward.
Oh, wow.
Rather than more. And then BP was the partner with a company called TNK back in the 2000s, which eventually got bought up and gobbled into Rosneft. So they're now a minority shareholder in Rosneft. So the assets that the three of them have, it's highly questionable whether the Russians can operate any of them, certainly not in the case of the Sakhalin projects. So we're actually going to see, assuming nothing else goes wrong, assuming no sanctions, assuming no boycotts, assuming insurance is unaffected, we're going to see an absolute reduction very rapidly in Russian output anyway, because the Russians' new projects that they brought in the last 20 years, they're not in Western Siberia, they're in Eastern Siberia. They're smaller, they're deeper, they're more remote. And Russians do not have the technical skill to do it. They've been relying on Western companies. So will the Western companies who invested in this sector lose everything? Yeah, I'd argue they already have. But it's not like the Russians are getting much because they can't make any of it work. And we're going to see echoes of that through a lot of the Russian economy this year.
I want to talk about poop, Peter, namely fertilizer. How bad is this going to affect the food supply? Because I know that Ukraine is a producer. Okay, yeah. Ukraine and Russia are producers.
We have phosphate shortages because the Chinese are terrified about food shortages. So they've blocked all exports. That's going to last for at least the rest of this year, probably all of next year as well. We have a nitrogen fertilizer shortage because nitrogen fertilizer is synthesized from natural gas. We were already looking at high natural gas prices nearing record levels before the Russian invasion, and Russia is also the world's largest exporter